Major Richard Cole grabbed Captain Olivia Marsh by the arm and dragged her into the center of the training circle in front of 300 soldiers. "Let's find out right now," he said, loud enough for every man in that field to hear. "If your little reports can save you from a real soldier." The laughter started slow, then spread like a brush fire across the battalion. Olivia didn't move, didn't flinch. She just looked at him with eyes that had seen things he couldn't imagine, and she said very quietly, "Careful, Major. You're about to make the biggest mistake of your career." Nobody laughed at that part. If you're new here, follow along, like this story, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning started the way most mornings at Fort Caldwell started, with the smell of diesel fuel and burnt coffee and the sound of boots hitting gravel before the sun had finished rising over the Texas hill country. Captain Olivia Marsh had been awake since 4:30. Not because formation was at 6. She was always awake at 4:30. It was a habit she'd never been able to shake, the kind that gets wired into you after enough years of needing to know what was happening before everyone else did. She sat at her desk in the intelligence annex with a cup of coffee she'd made herself. The communal pot in the break room hadn't been cleaned in 2 weeks, and she'd stopped trusting it. And she worked. She worked the way she always worked, quietly, methodically. Her eyes moved across 3 monitors simultaneously, pulling patterns from signals data and cross-referencing supply manifests against unit movement logs, looking for anything that didn't line up the way it was supposed to. There was something in the numbers that had been bothering her for the past 11 days. Not enough to bring to Colonel Hargrove yet. Not enough to be certain, but enough that she kept coming back to it, the way you keep pressing on a bruise to check if it still hurts. It still hurt. She closed the tab, saved her notes to a secure drive, and started getting ready for the day. Fort Caldwell was a large installation. Not the biggest in Texas, but serious. Roughly 4,000 personnel, a full combat brigade, training ranges that stretched for miles in every direction. It was the kind of base where careers were made by people who were loud and decisive and willing to put themselves in front of every available camera. Intelligence officers didn't generally thrive in that environment. They worked in the background, passed information upward, and were largely invisible until something went wrong, at which point everyone suddenly remembered they existed and wanted answers immediately. Olivia had been at Caldwell for 8 months. In those 8 months, she had filed 43 reports, flagged 6 anomalies that turned out to be significant, and spoken at exactly 2 command briefings. She had been invited to none of the social functions that mattered. She had been CC'd on emails she was supposed to be leading. She had been introduced at a senior staff meeting as our analyst by a colonel who had her name on a plaque outside her office door. She had noted all of this without comment and kept working. Major Richard Cole noticed her for the first time on a Tuesday morning in October, which was unfortunate for both of them, though the damage was considerably more one-sided than Cole understood at the time. I was crossing the quad between the operations center and the motor pool when he saw her coming the other way. A woman in ACUs, medium height, no particular expression, carrying a tablet and a coffee cup. He didn't recognize her immediately. Fort Caldwell had a lot of personnel, and Cole didn't make a habit of learning the names of people who didn't report directly to him or outrank him. He checked her rank insignia. Captain. Below him. He kept walking. But then Sergeant First Class Drayton, who was walking with Cole, said, "That's the intel officer, the one who flagged the comms irregularity last month." Cole glanced back. "The analyst?" "Yes, sir." He watched her disappear around the corner of the annex building. "She looks like somebody's accountant." Drayton didn't respond to that, which was the appropriate choice. Cole was not a stupid man. That was important to understand about him. He had served for 19 years, done 2 deployments to Iraq and 1 to Afghanistan, earned a combat infantryman badge and a Bronze Star with V device. He had real experience and real accomplishments, and none of that was in question. The problem with Cole, the specific structural problem, was that he had come up in an environment where certain things had been rewarded so consistently that he had stopped questioning whether those things were actually virtues. Dominance in physical demonstrations, loud confidence, the ability to command a room by sheer force of personality. He had been told his entire career in 100 small ways that these were the markers of a real soldier. Everything else was supplementary. Paperwork, analysis, intelligence work. That was the stuff you handed off to support personnel so you could focus on the real job. He had never seriously examined that belief. He'd never had a reason to. The first time Cole publicly condescended to Olivia was at a planning session in the operations center 6 days after Drayton pointed her out on the quad. The session was a routine coordination meeting, upcoming training rotations, range schedules, logistics for a battalion-level exercise scheduled for the following month. Olivia was there because the exercise, called Operation Iron Shield, had intelligence components that required her input on simulated threat environments. She had prepared a 15-page assessment. She had briefed Colonel Hargrove on it privately 2 days before. She was prepared to walk the room through the key conclusions in about 8 minutes. Cole arrived 4 minutes late, poured himself coffee, and sat down at the far end of the table. He leafed through the assessment packet for about 90 seconds before dropping it on the table with a sound that was just barely too loud. "Captain," he said, not looking up, "some of this data is 6 weeks old." "The regional pattern analysis is from 6 weeks ago," Olivia said. "The threat modeling is updated as of last Thursday. They're separate sections. The dates are in the headers. I'm seeing some gaps in the movement tracking. Those are deliberate. The gaps reflect periods where we don't have reliable signal coverage. I annotated them." He looked up then. "You annotated the gaps?" "Yes, sir." Something in his expression shifted. Not angry exactly, more like amused in a way that wasn't kind. "And you think annotating what you don't know is the same as knowing it?" The room got quiet in the specific way rooms get quiet when someone with rank is being openly dismissive and everyone else is waiting to see how it lands. "No, sir," Olivia said. "I think annotating what I don't know is more useful than pretending I know it. If you'd like, I can walk you through the methodology." Cole held her gaze for a moment, then looked away and said, "To the room generally, let's move on." He didn't bring it up again that session, but the damage was done in the way that invisible damage gets done. Nobody said anything, everyone noticed, and the calculus of the room shifted a few degrees in a direction that wasn't good for Olivia. Over the following 3 weeks, Cole made a habit of it, not overtly hostile. Nothing that could be formally documented, just the persistent low-grade signal that the intelligence officer didn't quite belong in the same category as the operators. A question redirected. A comment undercut. An introduction at a visitor briefing where he described her work as the background stuff. Small things, consistent things. Olivia tracked them the way she tracked everything, methodically, without visible reaction, filing them away in a part of her mind that she checked periodically to make sure the pattern was what she thought it was. It was. She also kept working on the thing in the numbers that was bothering her. It had gotten more specific in the past 2 weeks. She now had a clearer sense of what she was looking at, though she was still short of the evidentiary threshold she needed to bring it formally to Hargrove. She was being careful. Whatever was happening in those supply manifests, she needed to be certain before she moved. The incident that changed everything happened on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after Cole first noticed her on the quad. It was a combined training day, combat proficiency assessments, running alongside the intelligence section's exercise preparation work. Cole had organized the physical component, which meant the battalion's open training field had about 300 soldiers moving through various stations. Weapons familiarization, combatives drills, land navigation refreshers. Olivia was crossing the field to reach the signals tent on the far side, cutting through because it was the direct route, when Cole spotted her. She didn't register his expression immediately because she wasn't looking at his face. She was reading something on her tablet. She looked up when she heard her name. "Captain Marsh." Cole's voice was carrying, intentionally carrying. "You're welcome to join us." She stopped, looked at him. Looked at the training circle where 2 soldiers had just finished a combatives demonstration, at the crowd of men and women arranged in a loose perimeter around it. Looked back at Cole. "I have a coordination meeting in 20 minutes, sir." "This'll only take a few minutes," he smiled at her, and it was the kind of smile that wasn't a smile at all. "We're doing a little demonstration for the battalion. Practical problem solving under physical pressure. Since you're the one telling us how to think about threats, I thought it might be useful for the analysts to get a feel for what the operators actually go through." Someone laughed. Not Cole. Someone in the crowd. A small sound, quickly suppressed. Olivia looked at the circle. She looked at Cole. She understood exactly what was happening. "Sir, I don't think this is—" "That's an order, Captain." The word landed in the field like something dropped from a height. Around the perimeter, soldiers who had been talking to each other went quiet. A few shifted their weight. Nobody moved. Olivia held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she walked to the edge of the circle, set her tablet down on a nearby equipment case, and stepped inside. Cole gestured to a soldier on the far side of the circle. Corporal Vance, one of the battalion's combatives instructors, known around Caldwell for being genuinely difficult to take down. He was several inches taller than Olivia and built like someone who had been doing this since before he could legally drink. He walked into the circle with the easy confidence of a man who has never had a reason to be nervous about a situation like this. "Keep it controlled," Cole said. "This is a demonstration." He said it the way you say something when you don't entirely mean it. Vance came at her steady and direct, the way trained fighters move. Not rushing, measuring distance, watching her hands. Olivia stood with her weight slightly back, hands loose at her sides. She looked almost relaxed. Not performing relaxation. Actually calm, the way water is calm when there's nothing disturbing the surface. The first thing Vance did was try to grab her, a basic control hold, the kind you'd use to take someone down without hurting them, exactly appropriate for a demonstration. Olivia let him get half a step into it. Then she was somewhere else. She'd rotated left, used his forward momentum, redirected his weight with her left hand, and his center of gravity went somewhere he hadn't planned for. He went down on one knee, caught himself, looked up at her. She was already back in her neutral position, hands at her sides. The field was so quiet that Olivia could hear the wind moving through the equipment flags at the far end of the range. Vance stood up. He was not embarrassed yet. That had been fast, sure, but maybe a fluke. He came at her again, this time lower, a wrestler's shot at the legs. Olivia moved left. Not jumped, not threw herself aside, just stepped left with a precision that looked almost slow. And as he came through the space where she'd been, she placed her palm flat on the back of his shoulder blade and applied a downward pressure at exactly the angle that would use his own momentum against him. He rolled forward, hit the ground, and lay there for a moment looking at the sky. The field stayed silent. He got up a third time. This time, he was genuinely trying. He came at her with both hands up, a combination that he'd trained for years, and Olivia blocked the first movement with her forearm, stepped inside his reach, and used a pressure point technique on his wrist that made his hand open involuntarily and his elbow lock at an angle that was immediately, intensely uncomfortable. She held it for 2 seconds, enough to establish control without causing injury, then released. Vance stepped back. He was breathing harder than the physical exertion explained. He looked at her with an expression that had moved past confusion into something more complicated. Olivia stepped back to her starting position and looked at Cole. Cole was not smiling anymore. Around the perimeter, 300 soldiers were very still. A few of them had expressions they were working to control. Not mockery. Something closer to the way people look when they've seen something they need to recalibrate around. Sergeant Marcus Holt, standing 4 positions to Cole's left, had gone very quiet in a specific way. He had 11 years in, including 3 with a unit he didn't talk about at Caldwell because what that unit did wasn't discussed in ordinary company. He knew what he'd just seen, not just technique. Technique could be learned. He'd seen the economy of it, the way she'd read Vance's movement before Vance made it, the absence of wasted motion. There was no showing off in any of it, no performance. She had used exactly as much as the situation required and nothing more. He had seen people who moved like that before, a very small number of them. None of them were what you'd call ordinary officers. Cole recovered faster than some people would have. He was, as noted, not stupid. "Impressive," he said, which was technically true and communicated absolutely nothing of what he was actually feeling. He looked at the assembled battalion. That's what cross-training looks like. Different specializations, different tools. He looked at Olivia. "Good work, Captain." He delivered it with a tone that was supposed to put her back in the category of something he was managing, a demonstration that he controlled the narrative regardless of what had just happened. Olivia retrieved her tablet from the equipment case. "Sir," she said, and walked off the field toward the signals tent. Behind her, she heard the noise begin. Not laughter, something different. The low-frequency hum of a crowd processing something unexpected. She didn't turn around. In the signals tent, she sat down across from Specialist Keene and pulled up her notes from where she'd left off. "Everything okay?" Keene said. "I was 23 and had the specific situational awareness of someone who knew when to ask questions and when not to." He was asking carefully. "Fine," Olivia said. Let's go through the comms mapping for the Eastern Corridor. They went through the comms mapping. Olivia kept her voice level and her focus on the work and didn't think about Cole or Vance or the 300 sets of eyes that had been watching. She thought about the numbers in the supply manifest and the gap that kept growing between what was documented as received and what could actually be accounted for in inventory records. She was getting close. She could feel it the way you feel something when the evidence is starting to converge. But she was also aware, had been aware for weeks, and was now more aware than before, that whatever was happening in those supply chains was connected to people who had authority at this base. People who would not be pleased to be found out. People who might take steps if they realized someone was looking. The question of how much time she had was suddenly more pressing. She left the signals tent at 11:40. The training field was still active on her left as she crossed the quad, and she could see Cole standing with a group of NCOs near the operations center entrance. He didn't look at her. She didn't look at him. But she saw Sergeant Holt, who was standing slightly apart from the group, and Holt looked at her directly. Not with hostility, with the expression of a man trying to figure something out. She kept walking. In her office, she locked the door. A habit, not paranoia, she told herself, though the line between those two things had been blurring for the past week, and pulled up the most recent version of the manifest analysis. 11 days of data, cross-referenced against 3 separate inventory systems. The number that kept appearing, the discrepancy that kept refusing to resolve, sat there on her screen like something that had been there all along and had just been waiting for her to look directly at it. $47,000. That was the minimum discrepancy she could document with confidence. The real number was almost certainly higher. The methodology someone was using to obscure it was competent. Not brilliant, but competent enough that it had gone undetected for however long it had been running. She had found it by accident, following a thread from the comms irregularity she'd flagged 6 weeks ago, which had led her sideways into the supply chain data, which had led her here. She needed one more piece, one document that she hadn't been able to access yet because it required authorization from a level above her own. She had put in a request for it 10 days ago through official channels. She had received no response. That morning, before the training field incident, she had decided to wait another 5 days before escalating. Now, sitting in her locked office with the numbers on her screen, she revised that timeline. She would wait 2 more days. Then she would go directly to Hargrove, evidence threshold or not. She was saving the file when her desk phone rang. She picked it up. Captain Marsh, it was Sergeant Holt's voice. She recognized it immediately, though he'd never called her directly before. I don't want to take up your time. I just wanted to say... He paused. A brief pause, but she noticed it. What I saw this morning, I've seen that before, that specific set of skills. It's not something you pick up at the Garrison Combatives course. Olivia waited. I'm not asking questions, Holt said. I want you to know that some of us are paying attention to more than just what Cole says. Another pause. Ma'am. She held the phone for a moment. I appreciate that, Sergeant. Yes, ma'am. He hung up. She set the phone down and looked at the window. Outside, the training field had shifted to a different phase. She could hear the commands being called in the distance, the rhythm of a formation moving through drills. 300 soldiers who had this morning watched a demonstration that Cole had engineered to be humiliating and had turned into something else entirely. She thought about what Holt's call meant. Not the obvious meaning, the reassurance, the acknowledgement. The other meaning. If someone like Holt had noticed enough to pick up the phone, others had noticed too. And if people were noticing, Cole would hear about it. And Cole, who had not achieved what he'd planned this morning, would not let it rest there. She pulled up the manifest file again. 2 days. She would move in 2 days. She didn't know yet that she wouldn't have 2 days. That by the following morning, an event none of them had anticipated would accelerate every timeline on the base and force choices that couldn't be walked back. What she did know, as she sat in the late morning quiet of her locked office with the numbers arranged in front of her, was that the thing in the supply chain wasn't just theft. It was bigger than that. Someone was using the discrepancy as cover for something that involved the exercise, Operation Iron Shield, scheduled for the following month. And the exercise involved 400 soldiers, live fire ranges, classified communications protocols, and a realistic threat simulation that someone with inside knowledge could turn into something far more dangerous than a training event. She stared at the screen. The numbers looked back at her. Outside, Cole's voice carried across the quad, sharp, commanding, entirely confident. And she could hear the responding movement of the formation, the immediate physical compliance of 300 trained soldiers responding to his authority. She thought, he doesn't know what's coming yet. She thought, neither do I. She opened a new document and started typing. Not a report, not yet. Notes. The beginning of the architecture of what she would eventually have to explain to someone with the authority to act on it, laid out in a sequence that would be undeniable. She had been good at this for a long time. Making invisible things visible. Finding the shape of something in the dark before anyone else knew there was something to find. She had been doing it in places Cole didn't know existed, for people whose names never appeared in any record he would ever have access to, long before she ended up at Fort Caldwell, writing reports that he dismissively flipped through at planning sessions. She typed. The afternoon light moved across her desk. Somewhere across the base, in an office she hadn't identified yet, but was getting closer to locating, a man who had been carefully moving numbers for 8 months looked at his own screen and felt for the first time the specific unease of someone who is no longer certain they haven't been found. He didn't know who had found him yet. He would know soon enough. He didn't know who had found him yet, but by the time the base alarm went off at 03:47 the following morning, he was already moving. The sound that pulled Olivia out of sleep wasn't the alarm itself. It was the specific quality of it, not the standard training alert, which ran at a lower frequency and had a brief pause between cycles. This was continuous, high register, the kind that meant something had actually gone wrong. She was in her ACUs and out the door of her quarters in under 2 minutes. The night air hit her with the smell of diesel and something else. Smoke, faint but real, coming from the direction of the logistics compound on the base's eastern edge. She could see lights moving over there. A vehicle. 2 vehicles. The silhouettes of people moving fast in a way that wasn't organized. She pulled out her phone and called Specialist Keene. He picked up on the second ring, which told her he'd been awake. Ma'am. What happened? Fire in the supply depot. Building 7. It started about 15 minutes ago. They've got it mostly contained, but there's damage. He paused, and in the pause she heard something. Captain, the automated inventory system crashed when the fire suppression triggered. The backup is running, but it's pulling data from 12 hours ago. She stopped walking. Which 12 hours? Before last night's receiving log was processed. So everything that came in yesterday afternoon, the Iron Shield pre-positioning shipment, none of it's in the system right now. She started walking again, faster. Who else knows that? The logistics sergeant flagged it to the duty officer about 5 minutes ago. I don't know if it's gone up the chain yet. Get to the signals tent. Don't touch anything on the supply side. I'll be there in 8 minutes. She hung up and kept moving, and what she was thinking was not about the fire. She was thinking about timing. A fire in the supply depot at 0347 on the night before a major pre-positioning shipment was supposed to be reconciled against the inventory records. A fire that happened to crash the system at exactly the moment when a documentation gap would be most useful to someone who needed things not to be counted. That was not a coincidence. She was nearly certain of it. The logistics compound was controlled chaos when she arrived. The fire itself was out, or close to it. A crew was still working the edges. But the smoke was thick enough that people were moving with their faces turned away from the wind. She could see Major Cole across the compound, standing with the duty officer and 2 NCOs, his posture carrying the specific rigidity of someone who had been woken up and was angry about it. He saw her. Something moved across his face that she couldn't fully read in the dark and smoke. She didn't go to him. She went to the logistics sergeant, a short, compact woman named Sergeant Prescott, who was standing by the entrance to the undamaged section of Building 7 with a tablet and an expression of someone who had been fighting a losing battle against a malfunctioning system for the past half hour. "What do you have?" Olivia said. Prescott looked at her. "Captain, I'm not sure if—" "What do you have, Sergeant?" Prescott turned the tablet so Olivia could see it. The fire hit the server room secondary, not the primary. The primary is physically separate, but the crash pulled the inventory reconciliation offline, and when it comes back up, it's going to restore from the last clean backup. She pointed at a timestamp, That's 1,800 hours yesterday. Everything after that is in the processing queue, but not written yet. The Iron Shield shipment. Yes, ma'am. 247 line items. They were logged in at receiving, but not fully reconciled when the system went down. Olivia looked at the timestamp, looked at the damaged building, looked at the smoke still curling from the vent structures along the roof. Where's the physical paperwork, the receiving documents? Prescott hesitated. That's the thing. The receiving team left the hard copies in the processing room for overnight reconciliation. That's standard, but the processing room is in the section that burned. The silence between them lasted about 3 seconds. Show me, Olivia said. The processing room was accessible. The fire hadn't penetrated far enough to make the structure unsafe, but the inside was a wreck. Water damage from the suppression system, heat damage along the far wall, and on the table where the receiving documents should have been. A mess of soaked, partially burned paper that had been a stack of intake forms and was now approximately nothing. Olivia stood in the doorway and looked at it without going in. Has anyone touched anything in here since the fire was called in? Not that I know of, ma'am. Get someone from the MPs, right now. Don't let anyone in until they've documented the scene. Prescott was already reaching for her radio. Behind Olivia, from across the compound, Cole's voice. Captain Marsh. Not shouting, carrying deliberately, the way he did when he wanted people to hear that he was in charge of something. What are you doing in my logistics area? She turned. He was walking toward her, the duty officer half a step behind. In the emergency lighting, his face was harder to read than usual, but she could see that he was working at something. Working to look like a man assessing a situation rather than a man who'd been surprised by one. Talking to Sergeant Prescott about the inventory gap, Olivia said. Sir? That's a logistics issue. It's being handled. The timing concerns me. A beat. The timing of a fire. The timing of a fire that took out the receiving documentation for the Iron Shield preposition shipment on the same night that shipment was supposed to be reconciled. Yes, sir. Cole looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the duty officer, then back at her. His voice, when he spoke again, was very controlled. You're suggesting what exactly? I'm not suggesting anything yet. I'm saying the timing is worth looking at carefully before anyone writes this up as an electrical fault. This is a logistics investigation. It doesn't need an intelligence officer. Everything's connected to everything else, sir. That's kind of the job. It came out sharper than she intended. She saw it register on his face, not anger, something more complicated. The expression of a man recalibrating again, deciding what kind of problem she was. I want a full status report from the logistics section by 0600, he said to the duty officer. Not to her. Then he turned and walked back toward the operations center. Prescott appeared at Olivia's shoulder. MPs are on the way, ma'am. Good. And Sergeant, who was the last person to badge into this building before the alarm went off? Prescott looked at her tablet. The badge reader log is part of the system that crashed. Of course it was. Olivia walked back to her office through the pre-dawn dark. The smoke smell followed her for half a block. Then the wind shifted and it was gone. She could hear the base slowly waking up around her. Additional lights coming on, voices, the particular sound of a garrison population processing an unexpected event and deciding how worried to be about it. She sat down at her desk and opened her files. The manifest discrepancy she'd been tracking for 11 days, the $47,000 minimum gap she'd identified, looked different now. Not bigger exactly. But the shape of it was different. She'd been thinking of it as financial fraud. Simple supply chain theft, the kind that happened at large installations with complex logistics and not enough auditing. Somebody skimming. It was serious, but it was bounded. The fire changed the shape. If someone had deliberately destroyed the receiving documentation for a shipment, a 247-line item shipment that included equipment, materiel, and sensitive communications gear for a classified exercise, then this wasn't skimming. This was systematic. This was someone who had access to the physical spaces, the administrative systems, and the timing of logistics operations. Someone who understood the base well enough to know exactly what to burn. She pulled up the Iron Shield exercise plan. Not the full document, that was classified above her current need to know, but the logistics appendix, which she had access to. She scrolled through the pre-positioning requirements, equipment quantities, delivery windows, accountability checkpoints. She found it at line 87. A communications relay package, listed in the pre-positioning manifest, scheduled for delivery in yesterday afternoon's shipment. Specialized equipment for the exercise's command network. Value significant. More importantly, if that package had been diverted, and if the documentation proving it had been received was now ash in a burned processing room, then someone could have physically moved that equipment off base without it ever showing up as missing. The system would restore from the 1800 backup. The physical count wouldn't happen until the exercise itself started. By then, any discrepancy would look like a receiving error, not a theft. She sat back in her chair. The communications relay package for Iron Shield. She didn't know exactly what it did. The technical specifications were above her clearance level, but she knew enough about classified exercise infrastructure to know that a communications relay was not incidental equipment. It was central. It was the thing that made the command network work. If it was gone, Iron Shield didn't just have a gap in the inventory. Iron Shield had a vulnerability. She needed to know if that equipment had actually been received. Not what the system said, what the physical reality was. And the physical reality was currently sitting behind an MP cordon in a room full of wet ash. She checked the time. 5:21. She had 39 minutes before Cole's status report was due. She picked up the phone and called Sergeant Holt. He answered on the first ring, which confirmed he hadn't slept either. Sergeant Holt. It's Marsh. I need your read on something and I need it straight. A pause. Go ahead, ma'am. The Iron Shield communications package. Do you know the personnel involved in receiving it yesterday? Some of them. Sergeant First Class Marsh, no relation to you, ma'am, runs the comms receiving section. He signed everything in yesterday afternoon. Holt's voice had changed slightly, still controlled but attentive in a way she recognized. He was putting things together. Is the comms package in the building that burned? The documentation is gone. I'm trying to determine whether the equipment itself was actually staged where it was supposed to be staged. You think it wasn't? It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. I think I need to know before someone writes up an incident report that makes it very difficult to ask that question afterward. Holt was quiet for a moment. I can get to Building 4 in the next 20 minutes without making it look like I'm doing anything specific. The comms equipment should be in Bay 3 if it was received and staged correctly. Don't move anything. Don't tell anyone what you're looking for. Understood. Another pause. Captain, if what you're thinking is right, then we need to know before 0600. That's all. She hung up. She sat with her hands flat on the desk for a moment, feeling the specific weight of what she was doing. She was running a parallel investigation on an ongoing incident without formal authorization, based on an analysis she hadn't yet cleared with Colonel Hargrove, using a sergeant she'd spoken to exactly once before tonight. If she was wrong, that would be professionally significant. If she was right and had waited for proper channels, there would be a status report filed at 0600 that effectively buried the question for the duration of the administrative process, which would take weeks she didn't have. She chose. At 0544, her phone rang. It was Holt. Bay 3, he said. The staging area for the comms package. There are crates there. Right count, right labels. But the seals on 2 of them are different from the others. Different color, different application pattern. He was keeping his voice absolutely flat, which told her how not flat the information was. Somebody opened those crates after they were sealed at origin and resealed them. Contents? I don't have the authority to open them for inspection, but the weight's wrong. I picked up one end of the smaller crate. It's light, significantly light. The line was quiet. Get away from there, Olivia said, casually, and don't document that you were there. Already moving, Holt said, and then, Ma'am, what's in those crates? I don't know yet, she said. Which was the truth. What she knew was what wasn't in them. She spent the next 14 minutes writing the clearest, most precisely documented summary she had ever produced. Not the full analysis. There wasn't time, and a full analysis would take 2 hours she didn't have. But the core of it, the manifest discrepancy, the timeline of the fire, the receiving documentation gap, the communications package anomaly, and the connection to Iron Shield's command network infrastructure. 6 pages. Every claim sourced, every gap noted explicitly, no conclusion she couldn't support. At 0558, she walked to Colonel Hargrove's office. His aide, a young lieutenant named Ferris, was there because Ferris was always there before anyone else in the building. He looked up when she came in. Captain Marsh, the colonel isn't in yet. I need you to get him in. Right now, Lieutenant. I'm sorry to do this to you, but I need you to call him. Ferris looked at her face and made a decision. He picked up the phone. Hargrove arrived at Yo611. He was in uniform but not fully pressed. He'd come fast, which told her Ferris had communicated something useful when he called. He was a deliberate man, Hargrove. 51, combat veteran, the kind of commander who listened all the way through before he spoke. She had worked for worse. What have you got? He said, before he'd fully sat down. She put the 6 pages on his desk and talked him through it in 4 minutes. He didn't interrupt. He read while she spoke, which meant he was tracking both the written and verbal versions simultaneously. When she finished, he sat for a moment with his hands on the document. The communications package, he said. You're saying someone replaced the contents with ballast and substituted the seal. That's what the physical evidence suggests. I haven't opened the crates. And the fire was timed to destroy the documentation that would have caught the discrepancy. That's my read, sir. Hargrove was quiet for another moment. Then he picked up his phone and called someone. Not the duty officer, not the logistics section. She didn't recognize the number from the way he dialed it, but the tone of his voice when the call connected told her it was someone he didn't call casually. This is Hargrove. I need you at Fort Caldwell today. Not tomorrow. Today. He listened. I understand it's short notice. You need to hear this from me directly. We have a potential integrity issue with Iron Shield. He listened again, longer this time. Affirmative. Bring your people. He hung up. He looked at her. You're going to need to brief a team this afternoon, everything you have, including what you haven't put in the document yet. Yes, sir. Does Cole know about any of this? She held the question for a beat. He knows I was at the logistics compound and that I raised questions about the fire timing. He redirected the investigation to his duty officer. Hargrove's expression didn't change in any visible way, but something shifted behind his eyes. All right, he stood. Stay available. Don't discuss this with anyone except through me. He paused. Good work, Captain. She left his office and walked back toward the intelligence annex in the early morning light. The base was fully awake now. She could see people crossing the quad, vehicles moving on the perimeter roads, the ordinary rhythms of a garrison day beginning. Cole was standing outside the operations center with 3 NCOs when she passed. He watched her cross the quad. His expression was the kind that doesn't tell you what's underneath it. She didn't stop. She went back to her office, locked the door, and sat down. The thing she hadn't told Hargrove, the thing she hadn't put in the document because she didn't have enough to support it yet, was the identity of the person she thought was behind it. She had a name, not from the manifest data, not from the fire timeline, from a pattern she'd been tracking for 3 weeks that had nothing to do with supply chains, a series of administrative actions, authorization requests, and system access logs that converged on a single individual in a way that was not explainable by coincidence. The name was not Cole. Cole was a problem, had been a problem since the first planning session, would continue to be a problem because men like Cole didn't stop being what they were after one embarrassing morning on a training field. But Cole wasn't this. Cole was arrogant and dismissive and had spent 6 weeks engineering situations designed to make her feel small. That was its own category of damage. But it wasn't theft. It wasn't the deliberate sabotage of a classified military exercise for whatever purpose the missing communications equipment was meant to serve. The name in her head belonged to someone who had been at Fort Caldwell for 3 years. Someone with access to logistics systems, administrative records, and the kind of institutional knowledge that let you know exactly which building to burn and when to burn it. She had 80% of what she needed to put that name in front of Hargrove. She needed the remaining 20%, and she needed it before the team Hargrove had called arrived this afternoon, because once they were here, the investigation would move in directions she couldn't fully control. She opened her files. She started working. Outside, the ordinary sounds of the base continued. Cole's voice, somewhere across the quad, giving instructions about something. The sound of vehicles. The specific mechanical rhythm of a training installation running through its morning. And somewhere in one of the buildings she could see from her window, the man whose name she was carrying was making his own calculations. Looking at what had gone wrong the night before. Deciding whether he needed to move faster or whether the fire had bought him enough time. He didn't know she had already been to Hargrove. He didn't know what was coming this afternoon, but he was smart enough to be worried and smart enough to be dangerous, and the window between now and this afternoon was not as wide as she needed it to be. Her phone lit up with a message from an unknown internal extension. 4 words. You should be careful. She stared at it. Then she screenshot it, attached it to the document on her screen, and kept working. She stared at the message for another 3 seconds, then set the phone face down on the desk and kept working. Not because the message didn't matter, it did. It was the clearest confirmation she'd had yet that someone knew she was close, and that someone had access to the internal extension system, which narrowed the field considerably. She would deal with it, but in the order that made sense, not in the order that fear suggested. The 80% she had was built from 3 overlapping data streams. The first was the manifest discrepancy, the numbers she'd been tracking for 11 days, the minimum 47,000 gap that she now understood was not the total, but rather the visible portion of something considerably larger. The second was the access log analysis she'd constructed by cross-referencing badge reader data, system login timestamps, and administrative action records from the past 4 months. The third was a set of procurement authorizations that had been processed through channels in a way that was technically compliant but structurally wrong. The right signatures in the wrong sequence, approvals that predated the requests that should have generated them. All 3 streams pointed in the same direction. The name was Sergeant First Class Daniel Rourke. Rourke had been at Fort Caldwell for 38 months. He was assigned to the installation's logistics coordination section, which meant he had legitimate access to the supply chain systems, the inventory databases, and the receiving documentation processes. He was well regarded. Efficiency reports consistently above average, no disciplinary history, the kind of NCO who got things done without generating noise. He had been the primary administrator for the Iron Shield pre-positioning coordination. He had helped design the logistics timeline for the exercise. He knew exactly when the communications package was supposed to arrive, exactly what documentation would be generated when it did, and exactly which physical space that documentation would occupy overnight. What Olivia needed was the 20% she didn't have, the connection between Rourke and whatever entity or individual was on the receiving end of the diverted equipment. The theft was clear enough. The buyer, or the handler, or the intermediary, was not. Without that connection, what she had was a solid case for supply chain fraud, but a weak case for the larger thing she suspected this was part of. And the larger thing mattered, because the Iron Shield communications relay wasn't just expensive equipment. It was the nerve system for a classified exercise involving 400 soldiers and live fire ranges and simulated threat scenarios that someone with that equipment could potentially exploit in ways she didn't want to think about too specifically. She needed the financial trail. And the financial trail was in a set of external accounts that she didn't have direct access to. At 0822, her door opened without a knock. She had not locked it this time, which she immediately reconsidered. It was Cole. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, which was unusual enough that she set her pen down and looked at him directly. He was not in the posture he usually carried when he came to find her. The deliberate authority, the physical assertion of rank. He looked like a man who'd been awake since before the alarm and had spent the intervening hours doing something uncomfortable. "I know you went to Hargrove," he said. "Yes, sir." "Without coming to me first." She let a beat pass. "The timeline didn't allow for it." "That's not your call to make." "With respect, sir, it was exactly my call to make. That's what the intelligence function is for." He looked at her. In the morning light coming through her office window, he looked older than he usually did. Or maybe she was just seeing him differently now. There was something working behind his expression that wasn't hostility. It was closer to discomfort, which was not an emotion she associated with him. "Hargrove's bringing in an outside team," Cole said. "I know. This is going to go well above installation level." "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him work through something that he didn't say out loud, and then he said, "What you found. Does it touch anyone in the command structure?" She held the question. It was a reasonable question. It was also a question she wasn't going to answer honestly in this conversation, not because she didn't trust him specifically, but because she had spent 8 months watching him make assumptions about people based on what they looked like at first glance. And she was not confident he had entirely corrected that habit in the past 12 hours. "I don't know yet," she said, which was partially true. Cole nodded slowly. Whatever he'd come here to do, push back, reassert authority, demand to be briefed, seemed to recede. He looked at her in a way he hadn't before, and it wasn't the recalibration of the training field morning. That had been surprise. This was something more effortful. You've been tracking this for how long? 11 days on the manifest anomaly. The access pattern analysis goes back further. And you didn't bring it up in any of the planning sessions. I didn't have enough to bring. I needed to be certain. He let out a breath. I would have dismissed it anyway, he said. It came out flat, without apparent emotion, which made it land harder than if he'd been apologetic about it. Just a factual observation. A man who had the specific honesty that sometimes comes when a situation has gotten large enough that pretending costs too much. 6 weeks ago, I would have listened to you for about 2 minutes and told you to tighten up the methodology. She didn't say anything. I'm not saying that like it's a virtue, he added. She looked at him for a moment. I know, she said. And then, Sir, I need to keep working. I have 3 hours before the team arrives. He left without another word. She locked the door. The outside team arrived at 13:47, not the afternoon she'd expected. They'd moved faster than Hargrove's timeline. There were 4 of them, 2 from the Army Criminal Investigation Division, and 2 others who didn't introduce themselves by agency affiliation, but whose bearing and the specific way they looked at rooms before entering them told her enough. Hargrove briefed them for 20 minutes with Olivia present, then turned it over to her. She walked them through everything she had, all 6 pages of the document, plus the additional material she'd developed in the 3 hours since Hargrove's call, a reconstructed timeline, the access log cross-reference, and the procurement authorization anomalies laid out in sequence. She talked for 40 minutes. Nobody interrupted her. The 2 CID agents took notes. The other 2 just watched. When she finished, the senior CID agent, a woman named Warrant Officer Graves, said, "The financial trail you mentioned, the external accounts. I don't have direct access. I've reconstructed enough to see the shape but not the specifics." "We can get the specifics," Graves said. "How confident are you in Rourke as the primary?" "Very confident in his role in the logistics operation. Less confident about whether he's operating independently or on direction." "You think someone else is calling the plays?" "The procurement anomalies are too clean for a single actor working alone. There's an administrative fluency in how the authorizations were structured that suggests either extensive coaching or a collaborator with system-level access." Graves looked at her partner, then back at Olivia. "We're going to need the full access log analysis. Raw data, not the summary." "I can pull that in about 40 minutes. "Do it." While Olivia worked, the team spread through the building in a quiet and purposeful way that made the ordinary sounds of the garrison seem slightly unreal by contrast. Phones were used, documents were requested. Someone from Hargrove's office came and went with a sealed folder. The base outside the intelligence annex continued its routines, vehicles, formations, the mechanical sound of a training installation doing what it was built to do, and none of it knew yet how much had changed since EO 347 that morning. She had the raw data compiled at 1:31. She was walking it to Graves's temporary workspace when her phone rang. The caller ID showed an extension she recognized, the signals tent. It was Keen. His voice was controlled in a way that meant he was working hard to keep it that way. "Captain, there's something wrong with the Iron Shield comms network." She stopped walking. "Define wrong." "The primary relay is offline, not degraded. Offline. It went down about 11 minutes ago. The backup should have kicked in automatically, and it didn't. We're getting a null signal from the entire Eastern Command network." The Iron Shield exercise wasn't supposed to start for another 3 weeks. The network shouldn't even be active yet in its operational configuration. "Who activated the Eastern Command network?" she said. "That's what I'm trying to figure out. The activation log shows it came online this morning at 0630, before the team arrived. Captain, the activation was authorized under a command code registered to the Logistics Coordination Section, Rourke's section. The relay package," she said, "the one Holt flagged this morning. If those crates are empty, then whoever activated the network this morning knew it wouldn't work, and they did it anyway." She was already moving toward Graves's workspace. "Keen, don't touch the network. Don't try to restore it. Get Holt and stay by the signals tent." She pushed through the door into Graves's workspace and said, without preamble, "We have a problem. The Iron Shield command network just went offline. It was activated this morning using a code from Rourke's section, and there's no relay in place to support it. Graves looked up from the documents in front of her. Why would someone activate the network if they'd already taken the relay? It was the right question. Olivia had been turning it over for the 30 seconds since Keene called, and she had an answer she didn't like. To test the gap, she said, if you're going to sell intelligence about the exercise, about the command structure, the frequency allocation, the encryption keys, you need to confirm there's actually a gap before you deliver. You activate the network, confirm it crashes, confirm the backup doesn't engage, and now you have proof of concept. The room was quiet for a moment. Proof of concept for what? One of the unnamed agents said. For someone who wants to know that Fort Caldwell's classified exercise network is dark, and who can confirm it to a buyer. The word buyer sat in the air. Graves was already reaching for her phone. What happened in the next 40 minutes moved at a speed that had its own particular texture, fast, but not chaotic, the way things move when trained people respond to a situation they've prepared for without knowing this exact shape. Hargrove was briefed. The CID team expanded its scope formally. The two unnamed agents disappeared into a vehicle and drove toward the eastern perimeter with a purpose that wasn't explained to her. Olivia went back to her office and stayed there, working, because the work was what she could actually do, and the rest of it was now in motion in ways that didn't require her direct involvement. She pulled the procurement anomaly files and organized them into the sequence that would be most useful for an evidentiary presentation. She cross-referenced the access logs against Rourke's duty schedule for the past 4 months. She found 3 dates where administrative actions had been taken under his credentials during hours when his official duty log showed him off-post. She was documenting the 3rd date when her door opened again. This time it was Holt. He came in without being invited, closed the door, and said, "Rourke's not in his office." She looked up. Since when? Nobody's seen him since the morning formation. He signed in, attended PT accountability at YO 6:30, and then his section sergeant says he went to the logistics compound to assess the fire damage. Holt's face was doing something careful. He never came back. Does Graves know? I'm on my way to tell her. I came here first. He paused. Ma'am, if he ran, he might not have gone far. He still has logistics credentials active. He could be anywhere on post with a legitimate reason to be there. She stood up. Go to Graves. Tell her to pull his vehicle registration in the gate logs. If he left post by vehicle, there'll be a record. Holt left. She followed 60 seconds later, heading for the operations center. She found Graves in the corridor outside Hargrove's office, already on a radio. The gate logs were being pulled. Rourke's vehicle, a dark blue personal truck, Texas plates, had not been logged out through any gate since yesterday evening, which meant either he was still on post or he'd left by a means that didn't go through the gate system. Fort Caldwell had 4 official vehicle gates and approximately 11 miles of perimeter fencing. The fencing was not designed to stop a determined person. It was designed to control vehicle access and deter casual incursion. Hargrove came out of his office. We need to lock down the perimeter. Already requested, Graves said. MPs are on it. But sir, if he went over the fence, then we're looking for a foot approach to the nearest road access. Hargrove looked at Olivia. Where would someone go if they needed to hand off materials, physical materials, near this installation without using the gates? She'd been looking at maps of Fort Caldwell for 8 months as part of her threat environment analysis. The eastern access road runs within 600 meters of the fence line at the far end of the training ranges. It's used by contractors for range maintenance, low traffic, especially during non-exercise periods. If someone pre-positioned a vehicle there, how do we get there? 20-minute drive, 12 minutes by the training range service road if you have a vehicle with access credentials. Hargrove looked at Graves. Graves was already reaching for keys. The next thing Olivia knew, she was in the back of a government vehicle moving fast down a service road she'd only ever seen on maps, between training ranges that smelled of cordite and dry grass, toward the eastern fence line. Cole was not with them. She'd passed him in the corridor outside the operations center. He'd been briefed, was being kept apprised, and he'd looked at her with something she didn't have time to read. She kept moving. The vehicle stopped at the fence line. They got out. The eastern access road was visible through the fence, a strip of pale caliche cutting through the scrub, running roughly north-south. Quiet. No vehicles visible in either direction. But in the dust at the edge of the road, on the far side of the fence, tire tracks. Recent. And next to them, footprints in the dirt verge. Graves was on the radio immediately. The two unnamed agents had apparently positioned themselves without being told to, which answered the question of which agency they belonged to, even if their IDs hadn't. Olivia stood at the fence line and looked at the tracks. The footprints were a size 10 or 11. The tire tracks showed a wide-stance vehicle, a truck, or an SUV. The depth of the track suggested it had been there recently and left recently. The edges were still crisp. She looked north along the access road, then south. South was the direction of the county highway, 3 miles. She turned to Hargrove. He's already in a vehicle. He's been planning this exit for a while, the fence crossing point, the pickup. This wasn't improvised in the last 2 hours. How long? The way the logistics operation was structured, he was planning to be gone before the Iron Shield exercise started. The fire was supposed to buy him 2 to 3 weeks of documentation confusion. We moved faster than he expected. Graves came off the radio. We have a vehicle description from the county sheriff's department. Blue SUV, plates matching a rental agreement in Rourke's name registered 3 months ago. It was picked up on a traffic camera in Breckenridge 40 minutes ago. 40 minutes. He had a 40-minute head start in a vehicle nobody had been looking for until now. But 40 minutes on Texas roads with an alert going out was not an escape. It was a delay. They drove back to the installation. Olivia went directly to her office and pulled up everything she had on Rourke's external contacts. The financial trail shape she'd reconstructed without the specific account data, the communication pattern analysis she'd been building from signal metadata. She was looking for a destination, not where he was going, where he was supposed to go. The handoff point for the equipment, she found it at 1649. Not in the financial data, in the procurement records. A contractor address, a logistics company in San Marcos, 40 miles south of Caldwell, that had appeared 3 times in Rourke's procurement authorization files in contexts that made no administrative sense. The company was real. She'd verified that. But the specific authorizations it appeared in were for equipment categories that didn't match its service profile. She called Graves. San Marcos, she said. There's a contractor address. I'm sending it to you now. It appears in Rourke's procurement records in a pattern that looks like a cover address. If he's delivering the relay hardware somewhere, this is the most likely intermediate point. Graves didn't ask how she'd found it. Sending it up now. Stand by. She stood by. Through her office window, the late afternoon light was going gold across the training ranges. The base was running its routine around her. Formations, vehicles, the mechanical rhythms that continued regardless of what was happening inside the intelligence annex and the CID workspace. 300 soldiers going through their afternoon without knowing that the exercise they were supposed to run in 3 weeks had a hole in its command network the size of a stolen relay package. Her phone rang at 1703. It was not Graves. It was a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't pick up. She picked up. Captain Marsh. The voice was male, even, and belonged to someone who was not in a hurry despite everything. I think there's been a misunderstanding about what I'm doing. She said nothing. She was already reaching for a notepad. The equipment isn't going where you think it's going, the voice said. And the people who sent me aren't who you think they are. Rourke, she said. A pause. Then, you should know that what I took wasn't the worst thing that's been happening at Caldwell. It was cover for something else. Someone else. Someone who's still there. She wrote the time in the top corner of the notepad. Wrote Rourke, phone, and the approximate number. If you want to know what's actually embedded in Iron Shield, he said, you're going to have to look at who designed the exercise, not the logistics, the architecture, who wrote the operational framework. The line went dead. She stared at the notepad. Her hand had written the words without her consciously deciding to, who designed the exercise. She knew who had designed the exercise. She had his name on a dozen planning documents. She had sat in a room with him 6 weeks ago while he dismissed her analysis and told the room to move on. Her door opened. Cole stood in the doorway. His face was the color of someone who had recently been told something they weren't prepared to hear. Hargrove needs you, he said. Now, there's been a development. She stood. What development? Cole looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not anger, not the managed discomfort of their morning conversation. Something rawer than that. They found Rourke, he said. He's in custody. He's talking. He paused. Olivia. He's saying the person who built the intelligence gap into Iron Shield, the one who designed it so the relay could be pulled without triggering the backup, isn't in logistics. Another pause. Longer. He's saying it's someone in operations, someone with a long history here. She was already moving toward the door. He gave them a name, Cole said. I know, she said. She did know. She had known for the last 40 seconds, since Rourke's voice had said who wrote the operational framework in that flat, even tone. She walked past Cole into the corridor. She didn't say the name out loud yet, but it was there, sitting in her chest with the specific weight of something that is going to change everything once it's spoken. The corridor outside Hargrove's office was the kind of quiet that only happens when too many people are being careful about what they say out loud. There were 6 people in it, 2 of the CID agents, Lieutenant Ferris, a woman Olivia didn't recognize who was carrying a sealed evidence bag, and Cole, who had followed Olivia from her office without being asked and was now standing 2 steps behind her left shoulder. She registered all of this without looking directly at any of them. She went straight to Hargrove's door and knocked once. In, Hargrove said. He was standing, not sitting. That told her something. Hargrove sat down to process information and stood up when information had resolved into action. He was in the action phase. Graves was beside him with a legal pad covered in handwriting. The 2 unnamed agents, she had started thinking of them as unit, because nothing else fit, were positioned near the window like they'd been there for hours. Close the door, Hargrove said. Cole came in behind her. Nobody told him to leave. Rourke is in county custody, Hargrove said. He crossed into Callahan County before the state alert went out. He's cooperating, proactively. He glanced at the legal pad in Graves's hand. He's given us a significant amount of information in the last hour. About the framework, Olivia said. About a lot of things. Hargrove looked at her directly. He says he was approached 14 months ago. Not at Caldwell, prior to his assignment here. Someone identified him as a target, worked him over the course of 4 months, and by the time he received his orders to Caldwell, he was already committed. Committed how? Financially, he had a debt situation, not unusual for his rank and pay grade, and the approach came as a financial offer, money in exchange for access. They weren't asking him to steal equipment initially. They wanted position. Someone who could run logistics at a facility with a classified exercise scheduled. She absorbed this. They knew about Iron Shield 14 months ago. Earlier than that, apparently, the exercise was in planning for 2 years. Its existence wasn't classified, just the operational details. Someone with knowledge of Army exercise planning would have known the broad shape of it 18 to 24 months in advance. The room held that for a moment. The name he gave us, Graves said. She looked at Olivia, then at Cole. We need to move carefully here because the individual is still on post and has operational authority. Who is it? Cole said. His voice was flat enough that she knew he'd already started guessing. Graves looked at Hargrove. Hargrove nodded. Lieutenant Colonel Warren Steck, Graves said. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Cole's posture did something Olivia noticed peripherally. A slight shift, a settling, like something heavy had been placed on him suddenly. Steck. Operations officer. Fort Caldwell for 7 years, the longest-serving lieutenant colonel on the installation. The man who had written the Iron Shield operational framework, who had designed the command network architecture, who had specified the relay equipment that Rourke had stripped and replaced with ballast, who had been in the corridor outside 2 planning sessions where Olivia had raised questions about the manifest analysis and who had said nothing, which she now understood had been a specific choice. He's currently in the operations center, one of the unit agents said. He came in at 06:30 today and has been there since. Since the network activation, Olivia said. Yes. He activated the Eastern Command Network this morning at 0632, using his command authority. It's consistent with normal pre-exercise validation activity. Nobody would have questioned it without the context you developed. Cole said, he activated it to confirm the gap was in place. That's our read, Graves said. He needed to verify that Rourke had successfully positioned the equipment out of the relay path before he could deliver a proof of concept to whoever he's working with. Do we know who he's working with? Olivia said. Not yet. The financial thread goes through 3 layers of shell structure. We have people on it. Hargrove moved around his desk. We need to bring him in without triggering anything on his end. He has a personal device we haven't been able to access yet. And if he has a dead man protocol, a notification system that fires if he goes dark, we could accelerate whatever he's trying to deliver.
How long does he usually stay in the operations center? Olivia asked. She was looking at Cole when she said it, because Cole would know. Cole had worked alongside Steck for most of his time at Caldwell. Cole looked like a man opening a door he wasn't sure about. He takes lunch at the officers' mess at 12:30, reliably. He's been doing it for years.
Takes the same route, sits in the same corner. 20 minutes, Hargrove said to Graves. We can be in position in 15, she said. What happened over the next 20 minutes was precise in the way that operations are precise when there are enough trained people who know what they're doing. Olivia was not part of it directly. She was told to stay in the intelligence annex, which she did, because arguing would have cost time she didn't want to spend. She sat at her desk and listened to the base outside and thought about Steck. Specifically, about the 6 weeks she'd spent in planning sessions and briefings where he had been present, where she had raised questions and been redirected, where the manifest analysis had been subtly characterized as incomplete without anyone examining whether that characterization was accurate. She thought about whether he had known specifically about her, whether the message on her phone that morning, "You should be careful," had come from him directly or through Rourke. The extension it had come from was in the logistics coordination section, which was Rourke's territory. But the timing, after she'd been to Hargrove, after the team had been called, suggested someone with visibility into Hargrove's movements. Rourke couldn't have known about the call to the outside team at 0611. He'd already been at the logistics compound at that point, planning his exit. Steck could have known. Steck had a desk 20 meters from Hargrove's office. At 12:48, Graves called her. We have him. Olivia let out a breath she hadn't been aware she was holding. Quietly? He came out of the ops center at 12:31, took the south corridor toward the officers' mess, and we intercepted at the parking lot. No incident. A pause. He didn't say anything when we identified ourselves. Just nodded, like he'd been expecting it. That's not reassuring. No, Graves agreed. It isn't. We're transporting him to the CID facility at Caldwell now. We'd like you present for the initial interview, if you're willing. I'll be there in 10 minutes. She locked her office and walked across the base in the afternoon light. The installation looked exactly like itself. Vehicles, personnel, the ordinary geometry of a military post at midday. Nothing visible had changed. Nobody walking past her knew that the operations officer had just been taken into custody in the parking lot outside the officers' mess, or that the exercise they were all preparing for had been architecturally compromised by the man who designed it. She passed Cole outside the operations center. He was standing with 2 of his NCOs, and she could tell from the way he was holding himself that he'd heard about Steck. He looked at her. She looked at him. She kept walking. Steck was in a plain room with a table and 4 chairs when she arrived. He was in uniform, sitting straight, and he looked less like a man who'd been caught than like a man who had resolved to make the best of a situation he'd seen coming. He was 54, lean, with the specific composed quality of someone who had spent years in institutional environments and learned to use stillness as a tool. Graves was across from him. One of the unit agents was in the corner. Olivia sat down beside Graves. Steck looked at her when she sat down. Not with surprise. He'd been told she'd be there, with something more like assessment. The way he'd looked at her across conference room tables for 2 months, except now the context had shifted so completely that the look meant something different. Captain Marsh, he said. Colonel, you did this faster than I expected. It wasn't a compliment, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the observation of a professional acknowledging another professional's work. You left a pattern, she said. I know. I trusted Rourke to execute more cleanly than he did. He paused. In retrospect, I should have handled the documentation side myself. Why didn't you? Because involving myself directly in the physical logistics would have created a different kind of record. What I did stayed in the administrative layer. Harder to find. He looked at the table briefly, then back at her. Harder, but not impossible, apparently. Graves opened a folder. Colonel Steck, you've been read your rights. We want to give you an opportunity to characterize your involvement before we proceed to formal charge specifications. I designed a vulnerability into the Iron Shield operational framework. I specified the relay architecture in a way that created a single point of failure that could be exploited by removing the primary relay package. I engaged Daniel Rourke 14 months ago to position himself in the logistics function at this installation. I directed him to divert the relay package and arrange for the documentation to be destroyed. He delivered it evenly, the way someone recites a prepared statement. I want that on the record clearly so there's no confusion about who made the primary decisions. Why? Olivia said. He looked at her. Why what? You've been at Caldwell for 7 years, 2 wars. Why this? Something shifted in his face. Not guilt. She didn't think Steck did guilt in the conventional sense. Something more like the residue of a calculation that had run its course. Money is the obvious answer and it's partially accurate, but the more complete answer is that I stopped believing what I was doing mattered about 4 years ago. When you stop believing something matters, the cost-benefit changes. He looked at the table again. I'm not asking you to understand it. I'm explaining it. Who are you delivering the vulnerability to? Graves said. He shook his head. That I'm not giving you. Not because I'm protecting anyone. I don't have particular loyalty at this point. But that information is my transaction with the prosecutor's office, not with you. Graves didn't push it. Olivia had expected that. It was the right play, holding the most valuable piece for formal negotiation rather than giving it freely in an informal interview. What she hadn't expected was what Steck said next. He looked at Olivia again. There's something you should know, not as a trade, just because it affects your ability to complete the Iron Shield assessment cleanly. What? The vulnerability in the relay architecture isn't the only one. When I wrote the operational framework, I built a secondary gap into the frequency allocation table. It's in the classified appendix, section 4, subsection C. The way it's structured, if someone runs the exercise as written, a third party with the right equipment could intercept the command network traffic regardless of whether the relay is functioning. He said it without apparent emphasis, like a piece of technical information being passed along. Rourke didn't know about that one. I kept it separate. The room was quiet. You're telling us this now, Olivia said, because 400 soldiers are going to run that exercise in 3 weeks if nobody fixes it. And whatever I am, I'm not interested in that outcome. She looked at him for a moment. She couldn't tell whether this was genuine or a performance designed to earn something with the prosecution. Maybe both. People were usually both. Where in the frequency table, she said, subsection C12 through C14. The allocation ranges are offset by 11 megahertz from what the documentation says. Anyone working from the published specs would be running blind. She wrote it down. The interview continued for another 40 minutes, covering the logistics timeline and the procurement anomalies and the financial structure, what he'd confirm, what he'd save for prosecution. When it was done, Olivia left the room and stood in the corridor for a moment with her notes, letting the specific atmosphere of the past 2 hours settle. Graves came out behind her. You okay? Yes. She paused. The secondary frequency gap. That's real? We'll have technical people on it within the hour. Graves looked at her. You should probably know, Colonel Hargrove's report on this is going to mention your analysis in detail. The manifest work. The access logs. The speed at which you connected the fire to the logistics operation. I didn't do it alone. Holt helped. Keene flagged the network anomaly. That'll be in the report too, but you were the one who saw the shape of it. Graves paused. Some people in that building, she meant the intelligence annex, have been working here for 3 years without catching what you caught in 11 days. Olivia didn't respond to that. She tucked her notes into her folder and went back to work. The afternoon moved in the way afternoons move when an investigation has broken open and needs to be fully documented before anyone can rest. She spent 3 hours in the intelligence annex, reorganizing her analysis into a format that served the CID evidentiary requirements: clean sourcing, precise timelines, explicit documentation of every inference and the data supporting it. She handed it to Graves at 17:20 with a 4-page summary and a set of attachments that cross-referenced every claim. At some point during those 3 hours, Cole came to her door again. He knocked this time. She looked up. Sir? He came in and stood near the door, which told her he wasn't staying. Hargrove told me what you gave Graves, the full analysis. He paused. I want to tell you something, and I'm going to be direct about it. All right? 6 weeks ago, I arranged that training field demonstration because I wanted to put you in a position that would confirm what I already thought about you.
that you were a support officer who'd gotten above her lane. He said it with the flatness of the morning, factual, not apologetic in tone but careful in its precision. I was wrong about what I thought I knew, and I was wrong about the method. He looked at the wall briefly, then back at her. What I did on that field was designed to be humiliating. I want to acknowledge that specifically. She held his gaze. I appreciate that, sir. I'm also aware that acknowledging it doesn't undo it. No, it doesn't. Something passed between them. Not forgiveness exactly, not its refusal either. More like the specific acknowledgement that two people in an institutional hierarchy had both done what they were going to do in a given situation, and now the situation had changed, and they were deciding what came next. Hargrove is going to recommend you for a commendation, Cole said. For the record, I'm supporting that recommendation. Thank you. He nodded and left. She sat for a moment with the quiet of the office, then went back to her notes. At 18:10, something happened that changed the texture of the day again. Keene called from the signals tent. His voice was carrying the specific controlled urgency she'd learned to read, as meaning the situation had developed. Captain, the technical team just finished the initial assessment of the frequency allocation issue. The gap in subsection C12 through C14, it's real, and they found something else. He paused. The offset isn't passive. It's not just a gap that someone external could exploit. It's structured as an active redirect. If the exercise runs as written, at the point in the operational sequence where the command network goes to full encryption, the frequency offset would route a portion of the encrypted traffic through an external relay point. She stood up. An external relay point that STEC controls. That's what they're saying. It was built into the framework as a feature, not a gap. The architecture looks correct unless you know the published specs are wrong. His voice went quieter. Captain, if the exercise had run as planned, 3 weeks from now, whoever is on the other end of that relay point would have received real-time encrypted command traffic from 400 soldiers on a live fire exercise. She walked to her window. Outside, the base was running its evening routines, the end-of-duty formations, vehicles returning to the motor pool, the gradual quieting of the operational day. Get the technical team's written assessment to Graves tonight, she said. Marked urgent. Already in progress. She hung up. The Iron Shield exercise was 3 weeks out. In 3 weeks, 400 soldiers would have been running live fire scenarios on ranges where the command network fed every position, every movement order, every tactical decision through a system that someone outside the fence would have been watching in real time. She had seen the exercise plan. She knew what it involved. The scale of what STEC had built was substantially larger than she'd initially understood. The relay theft was the visible part, the piece that Rourke could physically execute, the part that generated the documentation trail that she'd followed. The frequency redirect was the actual mechanism. The product being sold wasn't equipment. It wasn't even the gap in the network. It was access. Real-time encrypted access to a classified military exercise in progress. She wondered what that was worth to whoever was buying it. She had a number in her head, and it was large enough to make the $47,000 supply chain discrepancy look like petty cash. She was still at the window when her door opened for the 4th time that day, and this time it was Hargrove himself. He came in and closed the door. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who is deciding how to frame a series of things. You know about the frequency redirect, he said. Keene just briefed me. The technical assessment is going to command tonight. This has gone above my level as of about 40 minutes ago. He paused. There will be people here tomorrow who will want to debrief you at a level that's above what we've been doing today. I understand. What you've put together, the analysis, the evidentiary package, it's going to be the foundation of a significant federal case, both against STEC and against whoever he was delivering to. He looked at her in a way that was different from the morning, not just a commander assessing a subordinate's work, something with more weight. I want to ask you something directly. Sir? Your record here at Caldwell, 8 months. The way your work has been characterized in this building. I've been aware of it, and I haven't pushed back the way I should have. He said it without elaboration, which told her he'd been sitting with it. I'm asking you now because I want to understand. Was there anything in the past 8 months, any report, any flag, any analysis, that got buried or redirected that we should revisit? She thought about it. Not the question itself. She knew the answer. She thought about how to frame it in a way that was accurate without being an indictment of the environment, because the environment was complicated.
and the people in it were complicated, and she had long since stopped expecting either to be clean. There are 3 reports that were filed and received without action, she said. 2 of them were genuinely preliminary, not enough to act on yet, and in retrospect I don't think they were mishandled. The 3rd is the comms irregularity flag from 6 weeks ago. That one should have generated a follow-up meeting that never happened. That's the flag that led you to the manifest analysis. Yes, sir. He was quiet for a moment. If that meeting had happened, we'd probably be 6 weeks ahead of where we are now. She paused. But we're not behind. Steck is in custody. Rourke is in custody. The frequency redirect is documented. The exercise can be fixed. She said it without bitterness, which was not a performance. She genuinely believed it. The math of the situation was what it was. She wasn't interested in the version of events where she'd been treated differently, because that version didn't exist. The version that existed was the one they were in, and in it the work had gotten done. There's something else, Hargrove said. He reached into the folder he was carrying and pulled out a sheet of paper. The people coming tomorrow, in preparing the debrief package, we ran a standard background poll on the intelligence personnel involved. Yours came back with a classification flag. She said nothing. The original flag was from a previous assignment. The details are sealed above my level. He set the paper down on her desk, not handing it to her, setting it within reach. I'm not going to ask you about it. I'm telling you because the people coming tomorrow will have access to the unsealed version, and I want you to know that I've been informed it exists. She looked at the paper. It was a notification of classification flag, not the classified material itself, just the existence of it. Sir, she said, you don't have to say anything. I know. She looked at the paper. I wasn't always an installation intelligence officer. I know that too, Hargrove said. Now. He picked up the paper and put it back in his folder. Get some sleep, Captain. Tomorrow is going to be a long day. He left. She sat at her desk for a while after he left, not working, just sitting in the quiet of the office with the evening sounds of the bass outside and the full weight of the day arranged around her. She thought about Steck, about the 7 years he'd spent here, building something that looked exactly like what it was supposed to be until the moment it didn't, about the specific patience that required, the discipline of a long deception, maintained across thousands of small interactions and institutional moments, the way you have to keep performing the thing you aren't while building the thing you're hiding. She had known people who could do that. She had worked alongside them in environments where that skill was, in specific and controlled contexts, exactly what the mission required. She understood it from the inside in a way that most installation intelligence officers didn't, because she hadn't always been an installation intelligence officer. The classification flag was from 3 years before Caldwell. The assignment it referenced was not in any record that Hargrove or Cole or anyone at this installation had seen. The work had been real, and it had mattered, and it had ended in the way those things ended, not with a ceremony or a commendation or a public acknowledgement, but with a handshake and a reassignment and a sealed file. She didn't think about it much in the ordinary course of days. She thought about it now because something Steck had said in the interview room had settled in her without her fully tracking it at the time. You did this faster than I expected. She had. And the reason she had was not simply methodology or analysis or the 11 days of careful number tracking. It was pattern recognition built over years of work that nobody at Caldwell knew about, the ability to see the shape of a deception from the outside, because she understood specifically how deceptions were built from the inside. Steck had been good. He had been genuinely good, and she had found him anyway, not because she was lucky, but because she had seen his construction from an angle he hadn't accounted for. She stood up. She was going to go get food from the mess and then sleep for as long as the night allowed, which might not be long. She picked up her notes, locked her files, and turned off the desk lamp. Her phone buzzed. A message from Graves. Team debrief 0800. Bring the full access log. There's a name in the financial thread. She read it twice. A name in the financial thread. The 3 shell layers Graves had mentioned, they'd broken through one or more of them in the past few hours. She typed back, confirmed. I'll be there. She put the phone in her pocket. A name in the financial thread meant the buyer wasn't abstract anymore. It meant the thing Steck had been building toward for 14 months was connected to a specific person or entity that could be identified, charged, and shut down. It meant the case wasn't just a base-level criminal matter. It was something that connected to somewhere outside Fort Caldwell's fences, to a network that had identified this installation, identified this exercise, and run a patient 14-month operation to compromise it. She walked to the door. She stopped. The name. Graves hadn't included it in the message, which was operationally correct. You didn't put names in unencrypted text messages when you were in the middle of a federal investigation. But the fact that Graves had mentioned its existence at all, the specific phrasing, "there's a name in the financial thread," suggested it was a name that required preparation, a name that would mean something to the people in the room tomorrow. Olivia stood at the door of her locked office with her hand on the light switch and thought about the shape of what she'd built in the past 18 hours and what tomorrow would add to it. Then she turned off the light and walked out into the Caldwell night, and the name in the financial thread waited in Graves's secured file like something that hadn't yet decided how large it was going to be. She slept 4 hours and 20 minutes, which was more than she expected. Her alarm went off at 05:30, and she lay still for a moment in the dark of her quarters, listening to the bass begin its morning. Vehicles. The distant call of a formation NCO. The specific quality of pre-dawn air at a Texas installation, dry and cool in a way that would be gone by 9. She got up, made coffee, and spent 40 minutes reviewing her notes before walking to the intelligence annex at 0640. Graves was already there. The 2 unit agents were already there. 3 people she hadn't seen before were setting up equipment in the secondary briefing room. Laptops, a secure communications terminal, a portable printer that was already running. One of the new arrivals was in civilian clothes. The other 2 wore uniforms without the standard unit patches, which told her enough. "You got sleep," Graves said. It wasn't a question. "Some." The name in the financial thread. Graves looked at the briefing room. "In there, at 0800, when everyone is present." She paused. "It's going to change the scope of what you thought this was." Olivia got coffee from the break room and went to her office and waited. She wasn't good at waiting. She was competent at it, which was different. She organized her notes into the sequence the debrief would likely follow, cross-checked 3 items she wanted to be certain of, and at 0752 walked to the briefing room. Hargrove arrived at 0758. Cole at 0801, which was the first time she'd ever seen Cole late to anything. He looked like he also hadn't slept well, which put them approximately even. The civilian, a woman named Aldridge, who introduced herself without agency affiliation in a way that had become familiar over the past 24 hours, ran the first portion of the debrief. It covered the technical assessment of the Iron Shield operational framework, the frequency redirect mechanism, and the scope of what would have been accessible to an external party if the exercise had run as written. She presented it in the flat, precise language of someone who had delivered this kind of briefing before and had learned to strip the alarm out of her voice without stripping the accuracy. What she described was not small. The Iron Shield exercise involved live fire ranges, encrypted command network traffic, tactical movement data, and, in its final phase, a simulated scenario using actual classified communications protocols that would be in operational use for the following 18 months. Someone receiving that traffic in real time for the duration of the exercise would have had a window into command decision-making patterns, encryption key behavior, and tactical communication structure that would have had value far beyond the exercise itself. Hargrove listened with his hands flat on the table. Cole was very still in the way that people are still when they're processing something large. When Aldridge finished, she nodded to Graves. Graves opened a folder. "The financial thread," she said. 3 shell layers. The first 2 are standard offshore construction, nothing unusual for this type of operation. The 3rd layer connects to a holding company registered in Cyprus with operational offices in 3 countries. She looked at the room. The beneficial owner of that holding company, identified through a combination of financial records and signals intelligence that we received authorization to access yesterday evening, is a former U.S. defense contractor named Gerald Foss. The name landed without drama. That was the thing about names. So they were never as large as the things they represented until you knew the context. Graves provided the context. Foss had run a defense contracting firm for 11 years before it lost several major government contracts following a procurement fraud investigation 4 years ago. The firm had dissolved. Foss had not been charged. Insufficient evidence? A settlement? The kind of outcome that left a person free, but professionally finished in the legitimate defense space. He had subsequently established a consulting operation in Europe. His client list was not public. He's been building toward something like this for 4 years, Aldridge said. Fort Caldwell and Iron Shield were specifically identified because the exercise involves communications protocols that are scheduled for wider deployment across 4 additional installations over the next 2 years. What he was buying from STEC wasn't just access to this exercise, it was a template, a proof of concept that he could sell or use as leverage across a much larger operational footprint. Cole said, "Where's Voss now?" "As of last night, Frankfurt," Graves said. "There's a federal warrant. Coordination with German authorities is in progress." "Will they move on it?" Hargrove asked. "They're motivated. This touches some of their assets too, indirectly." Graves closed the folder. The short version is that by the end of this week, Gerald Voss will be in custody or in the process of being extradited. The case against Steck is complete. He's already entered a formal cooperation agreement with the prosecutor's office in exchange for sentencing consideration. Rourke's case is slightly more complicated because his cooperation has been extensive, but his direct culpability is also significant. That process will take months to work through. Hargrove looked at Olivia. Captain Marsh's analysis initiated the chain that led to all of this. She didn't respond to that. It was accurate, and it made her uncomfortable in the specific way that public acknowledgement made her uncomfortable, not because she didn't believe she'd done the work, but because acknowledgement in a room felt like a different thing than the work itself, and she had never quite learned to inhabit both simultaneously. "The Iron Shield exercise," she said, because that was what mattered immediately. "The framework needs to be rebuilt from the architecture level. The frequency redirect is documented, but the full operational plan should be reviewed by people who weren't involved in the original design." "Already assigned," Aldridge said. "A new team starts Monday. The exercise timeline moves back 6 weeks." "The relay package," Olivia said. Rourke's handoff point was the San Marcos contractor address. "Was the equipment recovered?" "Recovered intact yesterday evening. The San Marcos location was a storage facility used by one of Voss's shell entities. The relay hardware is in evidence custody now." Graves paused. "Everything is accounted for." The debrief continued for another 90 minutes, covering the evidence chain, the formal charge specifications against Steck and Rourke, the personnel actions that would follow the investigation, and the changes to installation security protocols that the incident had made necessary. Olivia answered questions when they were directed at her. She ate half a granola bar she found in her jacket pocket. She drank 2 cups of coffee. When it was over, she walked out of the briefing room into the corridor and stood there for a moment, feeling the specific flatness that comes after a sustained period of high-intensity work when the urgency has finally resolved. Not relief exactly. More like the absence of pressure, which took some getting used to. Holt was in the corridor. He had presumably been told to wait outside the briefing room, which was consistent with his clearance level. He looked at her when she came out. "It's done?" he said. "The main part?" She paused. "Thank you. For the call, and for building 4. "I was doing my job," he said, which was what he would say. And it was true. And it wasn't the whole truth. He had made a judgment call at 0544 in the morning, based on a phone conversation with a captain he'd spoken to exactly once before, and he had made that call correctly. That was not just job execution. That was something else. The specific courage of trusting your own read of a person in a situation where being wrong would have cost him something. "You made a call," she said. "That matters." He nodded. They didn't hug. They were both in uniform in a corridor, and neither of them was a hugger. But something passed between them that was its own kind of acknowledgement. She went back to work. The next 2 weeks moved differently from the weeks before them. Not easier. The investigation generated paperwork and follow-up briefings and coordination requirements that filled her days past their normal edges. But differently. The texture of her institutional environment had shifted in ways that were sometimes visible and sometimes not. The most visible shift was simple. People looked at her differently. Not with awe. She would have found awe irritating, but with attention. The kind of attention that comes when an environment recalibrates around evidence it hadn't previously factored in. Officers who had routed around her in corridor conversations now stopped. NCOs who'd never spoken to her directly made eye contact and nodded.
Ferris, Hargrove's aide, started bringing her coffee when he brought Hargrove's, which was small but wasn't nothing. Keene said, "At some point in the second week, it's weird, right? How much the same it is and how different it feels." "It's the same building," she said, "and you're the same person." "Yes." He thought about that. "Doesn't seem like it should be enough." "It isn't," she said. "But it's what happened, so." Keene was 23 and still at the point where he expected the world to be logically consistent with itself. She didn't try to fix that. He'd figure it out in his own time. The less visible shifts were the ones that mattered more to her. The comms irregularity report she'd filed 6 weeks ago, the one that should have generated a follow-up meeting and hadn't, was formally reviewed, and its handling was documented as a gap in the installation's intelligence response protocol. Hargrove had initiated a review of how intelligence assessments were being prioritized and communicated across departments. It was bureaucratic and slow and would probably result in a process document that most people would read once and file. But it existed. The gap was on record. That mattered, even if it didn't feel like victory. Cole came to her office again 9 days after the briefing. He sat down this time, which was new. He'd always stood before. "The commendation went through," he said. "Hargrove signed it yesterday. Army Commendation Medal with V device." She'd known it was coming, but hearing it said directly had its own specific weight. "And Steck's formal charge specifications were filed this morning," Cole said. "Conspiracy to commit espionage, theft of government property, fraud. The prosecutor is not being conservative about it." He paused. "He's looking at significant time." "Good," she said. "Not with satisfaction, exactly. With the specific relief of a situation being given appropriate consequence." Cole looked at his hands briefly. "I've been thinking about the training field." "Sir, you don't need to." "Let me finish." He looked up. "I've been thinking about it not as something to apologize for again, but as a question. Why I did it. Not the surface reason. I gave you that. The actual reason." He paused. "I think I did it because you made me uncomfortable in a way I didn't know what to do with, and I converted that discomfort into dismissal because dismissal was easier." He said it with the same flatness he'd been using in honest conversations, but this time there was something less managed underneath it. "I've been in this army for 19 years and I'm good at what I do, and I've spent most of those years in environments where being good at what I do looked a certain way. You didn't look that way. And instead of being curious about that, I made it your problem." She looked at him. "You were wrong about me." "Yes. And you were also right that the analysis wasn't complete in the first planning session. It was preliminary, and I flagged that." She paused. "The way you handled it was the problem, not the substance." He considered that. Fair. "People are complicated," she said. "You're not a villain in this story, Major. You're a person who had a limited frame and operated inside it until the frame broke. That's more generous than it needs to be. It's accurate. I'm not interested in inaccuracy." Cole looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who isn't sure whether they've been absolved or just described, and has decided it doesn't matter because either way they need to keep moving. "What are you going to do now?" he said. She thought about it. "Rebuild the intelligence baseline for the revised Iron Shield framework. Work the personnel security gap that the Steck situation exposed. There's also a pattern in the regional comms data that I've been ignoring because Rourke and Steck were taking up all the space. I want to go back to that." "I meant longer term." "So did I," she said. He almost smiled. It was close enough. He stood up and left. The battalion formation happened on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the investigation concluded. It was a standard monthly formation, not a special event, not a ceremony organized around her specifically. Hargrove had decided, and she agreed, that the best acknowledgement was one that didn't make a production of itself. 300 soldiers arranged in the usual configuration on the main parade field, the command staff at the front, the familiar geometry of a military formation in morning light. Hargrove read the commendation citation. He read it in full, which took 4 minutes. He didn't abbreviate it or summarize it. He read every word, in his deliberate way, into the quiet of the field. The citation covered the manifest analysis, the fire response, the Iron Shield framework discovery, and the role her work had played in the federal case that was now in prosecution.
It was specific and factual and contained none of the language that commendations sometimes use to make things sound grander than they were. No brilliant insight or exceptional valor, just a precise accounting of what had been done and what it had prevented. When he pinned the medal, he said quietly, below the range of the formation's hearing, 8 months was too long for this to have taken. Sir, she said, which meant several things simultaneously, and he understood all of them. She stood at attention while 300 soldiers stood at attention, and she looked out at the formation, faces she'd been passing for 8 months, faces she'd seen laughing on the training field the morning Cole pulled her into the circle, faces that had watched her walk off the field without quite knowing what they'd seen. They knew now. Not everything. They didn't need to know everything, but enough. The shape of what had happened was visible to anyone paying attention, and she had learned over the course of her career that that was often all you could ask for. Not full understanding, just enough visibility that the truth could be seen by someone who was looking. Cole stood at her left, 2 steps back, in his position in the command staff. She couldn't see his face from where she was standing, but she was aware of him the way you're aware of things that have changed. Not as a threat, not as an ally exactly, but as a presence that had been altered by events in ways that weren't finished yet. He had real work to do to understand what he'd spent 19 years mistaking for leadership. She couldn't do that work for him. Nobody could. After the formation, Holt found her at the edge of the parade field. "How's it feel?" he said. She thought about it honestly. Strange. Strange good or strange bad? Strange like things have finally lined up with what they were supposed to be. She paused. Which should feel like more, I think. But mostly it just feels like the next thing needs to start. He nodded. That was the answer of someone who had actually been in situations that got resolved, not the answer of someone who expected resolution to feel finished. Things that end well still end. And then the next thing begins, and it's its own shape, its own weight, its own set of problems that you don't fully see yet. "The Steck case," Holt said. "You'll have to testify." "I know. Months from now, probably longer." "I know that too." She looked at the emptying parade field, soldiers breaking formation and dispersing to their morning duties, the field returning to ordinary. "It's not done. None of this is done. The prosecution runs for years. The Iron Shield rebuild takes 6 months at minimum. The personnel security gaps that Steck's access exposed, those need to be addressed systematically, not just at Caldwell, but at every installation with similar exercise profiles. You going to stay for that?" "Most of it, probably." She paused. "Hargrove floated a role expansion yesterday. Intelligence section lead, not just the analyst function. More scope, more access, more coordination with the operational side. Are you going to take it?" She looked at the field. Yes. It wasn't a hard decision. Not because the role was what she'd been angling for. She hadn't been angling for anything except the work, and the work would continue regardless of title. But because what had happened over the past 3 weeks had demonstrated something she hadn't been entirely certain of before she came to Caldwell. That this kind of work, in an institutional environment, with the friction and resistance and visibility that came with it, was something she could do. That she could operate inside a system that underestimated her, do what needed to be done anyway, and come out the other side with the work intact and the truth on the record. That was not a small thing to know about yourself. In the weeks that followed, the formal consequences resolved in the way formal consequences do, methodically, publicly, and without the dramatic single moment that situations like this tend to be imagined as having. They accumulate instead in documents and hearings and announcements and personnel actions that stack up over time until the weight of them becomes undeniable. Warren Steck was formally charged on a Friday morning. The charge specifications were public record, and they were significant enough that the story was picked up by 3 military publications and 1 national outlet that covered defense matters. The coverage was factual and specific about what he'd built and how long he'd maintained it. His name was on the record. His rank and his 7 years at Fort Caldwell, and his 2 wars and his Bronze Star were all on the record, alongside the conspiracy charge and the cooperation agreement and the sentencing recommendation that was substantially lower than what the charges alone would have carried. That was the deal he'd made. It was a deal that served the prosecution's need to reach Foss, and it had served that need, and that was how the system worked. She didn't love that. She accepted it. Foss was taken into German custody on a Thursday. Extradition proceedings began the following week. The Cyprus holding company was dissolved by court order. The 3 shell layers that had taken Graves's team hours to penetrate were documented in the federal complaint in a specificity that served the dual purpose of building the case and making it difficult for similar structures to be used again without detection. Rourke pled guilty to theft of government property and accessory charges. His sentence, which would be determined after his cooperation was fully assessed, was expected to be measured in years rather than decades. He was 29. He would come out the other side of it with something left, which was more than some people got. The Iron Shield exercise was rebuilt from its framework, a new operational architecture designed by a team that included Olivia in a consulting role that Cole had specifically requested she be assigned to, removed the frequency offset, rebuilt the relay redundancy, and added a monitoring layer that would flag anomalous traffic patterns in real time. The exercise ran 14 weeks after its original scheduled date, on a clear November morning with 400 soldiers and a command network that functioned exactly as documented. Nobody watching the exercise knew what had almost happened. That was fine. The people who needed to know knew. Olivia was on the range for the final phase of the exercise, not in a command role but as part of the intelligence oversight function. She stood at the edge of the observation position and watched the formations move through their scenario on the flat Texas terrain, the communications traffic running clean on every monitored frequency, the command network doing what it was built to do. Keene was next to her with a monitoring terminal. "All green," he said, at intervals, in the specific satisfied way of someone watching something work correctly. "Good," she said, at intervals. It was cold enough that morning for breath to show, barely. The sky was clear. The sounds of the exercise, vehicle engines, radio traffic, the occasional controlled detonation from the live fire component, carried in the dry air with a clarity that felt almost too sharp, like the morning was paying particular attention to itself. She thought about what Steck had said in the interview room. "I stopped believing what I was doing mattered." She had turned that sentence over many times in the weeks since, not because she sympathized with what he'd done with that belief, but because the belief itself was the kind of thing that could happen to anyone, the gradual erosion of conviction. The point at which institutional friction and personal cost accumulate past a threshold and the inner calculus shifts. She understood how that happened. She had come close to it, in a different time and context, in ways she didn't talk about. The difference, the thing that had kept her on the side of the work rather than on the other side of it, was not certainty and not strength in the conventional sense, and not some quality she'd been born with. It was smaller than that. It was the habit of choosing, one more time, to do the thing that needed to be done instead of the thing that was easier. Accumulated over years until the habit was stronger than the erosion. You could not control whether the institution you served saw you clearly. You could not control whether the people around you had accurate models of what you were capable of. You could not, in the ordinary course of things, make anyone acknowledge what they hadn't witnessed themselves. What you could do was the work, accurately, completely, without cutting the corners that nobody would notice you cutting. And then when the moment came, and the moment always came, eventually, if you stayed in the room long enough, the work would speak in a language that couldn't be misread, and the people who had been wrong about you would have to reckon with that. That was not justice in the clean, complete sense. It was something more available than that. It was the specific, ordinary justice of a truth that had become impossible to ignore. She watched the exercise run clean on the November morning and thought that this, the frequencies working, the network holding, the 400 soldiers moving through their scenario without knowing how close it had come to being something else entirely, this was what the work was for, not the commendation, not the acknowledgement in a formation, not even Cole's honest accounting of himself in a chair in her office. Those things were real, and they mattered, but they weren't the center of it. The center of it was standing on a cold range in Texas, watching something work correctly because 8 months of quiet, careful, underestimated work had made sure it could. "Still all green," Keene said. "Good," she said. The exercise ran to its completion at 1:37. The after-action review began at 1600 and ran for 2 hours and covered every element of the operational framework, command network performance, communications integrity, and tactical execution. Olivia sat in the back of the room and listened, asking 3 questions and making 2 notes, and otherwise staying out of the way of the people running the review, Because the review wasn't hers, the exercise wasn't hers. The whole thing was larger than any one person, and that was exactly how it should be. Hargrove caught her in the corridor afterward. "How'd it look from your position?" he said. "Clean," she said. "Every monitored channel, full exercise duration." He nodded. "The section lead role," he said. "Formal orders come through next week." "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me." He paused. "You earned the work. The work earned the role." He looked at her. "There's going to be a period where people are still recalibrating, where the institutional memory of how you were treated by some people here is still active. That's going to be uncomfortable sometimes." "I know." "You're going to outlast it." She looked at him. "I know that too." He left. She put on her jacket and walked out of the after-action building into the November evening. The base was quieting around her. End of a long operational day, vehicles returning, formations dispersing. The sky to the west was doing the specific thing Texas skies do in November, going orange and then pink, and then a deep blue that looks almost violet before the stars come out. She walked across the quad in the cooling air, past the building where her office was, past the signals tent, past the training field where none of this, and all of it, had begun. The training circle was just dirt, marked out with cones that someone had left up from the afternoon's PT rotation. In the fading light, it looked exactly like what it was. A circle of ground where people practiced things they hoped they'd never need. She stopped for a moment and looked at it. She thought about the morning 6 weeks after she'd arrived at Caldwell. The exact quality of the air, the sound of the crowd that had arranged itself into a perimeter, the weight of Cole's voice setting a trap that he'd been completely certain would work. She remembered the moment she'd walked into the circle and felt, not fear, but the particular clarity that comes when a situation finally stops pretending to be something it isn't. He had wanted to expose her. What he'd done instead was remove the last layer of cover from something she'd been keeping quiet for years. Not because she was ashamed of it, but because she'd learned that quiet was often more powerful than visibility, and that the right moment to be seen was the moment when being seen served the work rather than just the self. That morning had been the wrong moment, and she'd handled it the way she handled wrong moments. She'd done what was necessary and moved on. This was the right moment. Not because she'd been vindicated in the courtroom sense. The legal processes were still running and would be running for years. Not because everyone at Fort Caldwell now had an accurate model of her capabilities. Some of them did, some of them would come around, some of them wouldn't, and that was the reality of institutions. But because the work was done, and the work was real, and the truth of it was on record in a way that would outlast everyone's feelings about it. She stood at the edge of the training circle for another moment. The last of the orange light was going out of the sky to the west. Then she walked back to her office. She had reports to file and a section lead transition to prepare for, and a regional comms pattern she'd been meaning to look at for 3 weeks and hadn't gotten to yet. Tomorrow, the after-action documentation would need to be organized. Next week, the formal orders would come through and she'd need to brief her new scope to the department heads, which was going to be an interesting series of conversations with people who had spent 8 months routing around her and were now going to need to route through her. She was not naive about what that would be like. It would be awkward and resistant and sometimes openly difficult, and she would do it anyway, one day at a time, because that was how everything got done. Not in the single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of ordinary decisions made correctly when it would have been easier to make them wrong. She sat down at her desk, turned on the lamp, opened the regional comms file she'd been putting off. The numbers were already doing something interesting. She leaned in closer. Outside, Fort Caldwell settled into its night, 300 people going through their evening routines, the perimeter lights coming on along the fence line, the ranges dark and quiet after the day's exercise. A training installation doing what training installations do, preparing people for things they hope won't happen, in the knowledge that hope is not a strategy and preparation is. Inside the intelligence annex, in a locked office with a lamp on and coffee she'd made herself because the communal pot still wasn't clean, Captain Olivia Marsh worked. She had always worked this way, quietly, carefully, without requiring anyone to watch. She had learned long ago that the work didn't need an audience to be real. It only needed to be done. And when the moment came, when the situation finally demanded that the truth be visible, the work would speak for itself. It always did.